So today we'll be discussing errors and exceptions and how to handle errors and exceptions. So, okay, I'm sure since you started this program, you must, apart from the ones that I've showcased during the live session, while practicing on your own, you must have encountered various kinds of errors and exceptions. So in programming, exceptions and errors will definitely come up for a variety of reasons. It could be out of syntax errors, which are typical of people that are still new to programming, or let me say learners of programming. Or it could be exceptions that can occur irrespective of your level of proficiency in programming, or for how long, for however long you've been doing it. So you will expect exceptions, and you will also prepare to handle it. What will differentiate you is your ability to handle the exception, anticipate it, and handle it. So exceptions and errors are normal things. They are things that happen. So they can be broadly categorized into two categories. It can be categorized as syntax errors, or exceptions can be, or errors rather, can be categorized as syntax or exceptions. So they're either syntax errors or exceptions. So syntax errors, you think of syntax errors in the light of English language that is the official language in Nigeria. So if somebody tries to write down a simple English construct and say where it's supposed to have a comma, he omits a comma there. Or where he's supposed to have, where he's supposed to put a punctuation mark, he uses the wrong one, or he doesn't put it at all. So syntax errors are errors that can be seen just by observing the arrangement of your code. Yes, by observing your code, it can be immediately apparent. So typically, when you write any code and try to run it, before the code is executed, the computer checks for syntax error. So what it does in essence, it tries to pass. Passing, in this case, P-A-R-S-E. So passing in this case refers to like scanning or analyzing the text and ensuring that it is consistent with how a code should be written. So for instance, where there's supposed to be a punctuation mark, you have put a punctuation mark. So you can think of it like that. So if a computer returns syntax error to you, so it's basically the computer is unable to understand what you have written. So you've written English down and somebody is unable to understand it. So it's most likely a syntax error. So in the example codes below, we will try to have written some codes that will return exceptions. So we'll try to understand what the exceptions are and correct the exceptions. Okay, so let's start with this first example. Print hello world. If you have been part of this class from the start, this should be a no-brainer. It's quite straightforward. You can figure out where the problem is. So I would like to have one person point out clearly what the error is here. Just one person to speak.
There should be a bracket.
Okay, so
like the print is meant to be like
bracket. What should be enclosed in bracket?
The hello world.
Hello world.
Thank you. So we're supposed to have a bracket enclosure for hello world. And okay, I was actually supposed to run it before making the correction, so we could at least see what the error looks like. So let me do that. So there you go. There's an error. It tells you that it is what? A syntax error. So the computer expects a punctuation mark, or it expects it to be written in a certain way. Basically, it's not as if, yeah, maybe what you've written is ideally supposed to be correct, but because you missed out the punctuation, the computer is unable to figure it out. Or you've placed the punctuation at the wrong location. Just like if you mispunctuate a sentence, it can convey a wrong meaning, or it may not even convey any meaning at all. So we have corrected it by putting it in an enclosure. Sorry, please. So this is the correction actually. So this is what you're supposed to have as a correction. So I'll leave it this way so that when you are running it on your own, you'll see the error and you correct it below. Okay, so next here, this is a to-do. I'm not going to explain it at least too much. So you're meant to observe the code, study it, pick the exception there or the source of error there, and correct it. So here I've written the code for I in range 4. If I run the code, it's going to return an exception, an error. So correct the error and ensure it runs properly. So the next line is also the same thing. It's also going to return the syntax error, correct the syntax error, and ensure it runs properly. The next line is also the same thing. Trust me, if you've been following our classes up until this point, you are not going to have any challenge with these to-do exercises. So I have like 5 there. So do it when you have access to this material. So exceptions. Before I go to exceptions, let me make a point here that will also guide you. I will rerun this first example. So let's examine it again. Because what you are running here is an inbuilt function print. So the computer has passed it and has figured out, okay, this is a print. This person is trying to print something. And it's already giving you a clue here that you're missing parentheses in call to print. So did you mean to print hello world? So here you have a clear print. It won't always be like this. Not all exceptions are going to produce, not all exceptions are going to give you a clear solution to it. And I'm sure if you've been practicing what we've been doing till this moment, you must have seen a lot of instances where the error gets thrown, and even when you read it, it does not clearly tell you the solution. Yeah, most times it tells you what the problem is and where the problem likely is. So in this example here, I want you to take note of this little caret, this little caret here that I've highlighted. So the caret is signifying that there is error at this point of the code. So what happens is this. When the program is passing, when the interpreter is passing your code, in this case, it starts from the start. So the start being the very top, assuming you're having multiple lines. So, and it scans it one word at a time or however it chooses to, but it definitely starts from the beginning and goes to the end. So here it scans print, and that was how I was able to figure out that, okay, this print is an inbuilt function, and it was able to offer solution. So after scanning print, it gets here, and it knows that after it has scanned print function, it should get an open bracket. but it can't find the open bracket here. So the next thing it finds is hello world. Remember, this hello world is a single string. So it knows that, okay, this hello world is a single string. So the problem exists just before this hello world. So that is what it is telling us here. So by pointing this caret here, it's telling you that right before this thing here, this string here, there's an error. So it's better for you to look right before it and make the correction. So take note of that in attempting to solve this problem. Carefully read the error it throws. You are most likely going to get the solution from reading it as well. So exceptions now. On the other hand, can everybody hear me clearly, or is the background noise quite disturbing?
No, we can hear you.
All right, thank you.
I can hear you.
Okay, so exceptions on the other hand. You'll encounter exception even if your syntax is correct. You can still encounter exceptions. So exceptions refers to a wide variety of errors that can get returned for various reasons. So there are some built-in exceptions, and there are ones that when you write a module yourself, or when you write a function or anything, you can define exceptions on your own. So, but here we'll be talking about the built-in exceptions. So typically, when your code is executing, it can encounter some errors such as, okay, so you didn't declare a variable and you try to use such variable. So it's just like somebody coming to you. The person hasn't told you about anybody, and the person comes to you and starts saying, that person is this, is that. You'd be like, what person? Or which person are you referring to? I don't understand. So it's the same thing. So when you don't declare a variable, for instance, you're likely to get an exception. That's one. So let's think of mathematics. I'm sure we all know that when you try to divide a number by 0 in mathematics, on a typical calculator, you get maybe undefined or INF, which signifies infinity, or however the computer has chosen to represent it. I mean, the calculator has chosen to represent it. So, but mostly it's undefined. It has been argued that the most valid result of dividing a number by 0 is undefined and not infinity, because infinity itself is not a defined number. So it's more appropriate to say it is undefined. And the same way, when you try to make a division by 0 in Python, it's going to return an error, which is a 0 division error. So the error is telling you that you're dividing this by 0. So it's an error. Ideally, you're not expected to divide any number by 0. I don't know of any situation where it would be useful for you to divide a number by 0. I don't know of any, and I doubt if there's any. Most likely there is none. So you most times would even want to figure out when a result is going to give you a divide by 0 situation. So in the same way, if you try to divide any number by 0, give you a 0 division error. If you try to make use of an undefined variable, so it's going to give you a name error, just like the example of the person I said came to you and just started telling you that, do you know that person? I mean, that person has not even done well, or has done this, or has done that. You'd be like, what person? He hasn't told you about any person before, and he's trying to make reference to that person. So if you haven't defined a variable, you cannot make use of it. and it's going to return a name error, which means this name has not been defined. It's not just a variable in this situation, it can also be a function. Remember, when you define a function, you create a name with a function. So let's go through the syntax again. Def is what you start defining the function with, right? And next to it, you give the name of that function, and you open your parentheses. So if you don't define that name and you try to call that function, it's simply going to return an error that is not familiar with that name. So type error is another kind of error. So type error gets returned when you try to carry out certain operations on data types that do not match, or data structures that do not match. So it's typically you try to add a string to an integer, or you try to, in a list we can say use some methods on a list. So what if you try to use such method on an integer or on a string? You're going to get type error in such situation because the data type do not match, or the data types do not match. So that is what happens when you try to carry out certain operations on matching data types. So now let's go into detail examples of these three types of exception, starting with name error. I've explained what it is. So here, in this example, I am going to print hello world. Can anybody figure, before I run this code, what the problem could be with it? If you figured it out, just speak up.
The print is supposed to be in capital letter P.
The what? I can't hear you clearly, please. Can others hear me? Can others hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
I guess we lost him then. Can any other person attempt to tell what the problem is here?
The P is capitalized, I think.
Thank you very much. So let's run it.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, but not quite clearly.
Okay.
Somebody else has answered. Thank you very much. So now, I just ran the cell, and we can see here, name error. So let's try to read further. Here it's telling you to trace back most recent call last. So now let's see. It's telling you that this is where the error is. See that there's an arrow here pointing that this line is what has error. So there's another explanation here. Name error, which tells you the type of exception. Name print is not defined. So we're trying to make use of a name, an object name. An object can be a variable, can be a function. So we're trying to make use of an object name that has not been defined. In this case, print. Even though we know print is a defined function, but we've not written it appropriately. And that's why it is rightly throwing up an error. So in order to correct that, I'll leave this out, I'll comment it out, and uncomment the correctly written form. So, and there it is. Print hello world, written with small letter, has been corrected. You'll agree with me that if you are new to programming, or even if you're not new, you could sometimes just, maybe while typing really fast, you could just miss some things. It could be that you accidentally left your cap lock on or something, and you could also get such an error. So, but it's good you understand how it can happen and how you can easily solve it. So once you see such an error that tells you that tells you name error, and it tells you that a name is not defined, pointing to the cell that's actually done a lot of the job for you. You don't start scanning through all your code, as you have so many lines here. It has pointed to the specific line that has faults. Okay, so I leave it this way. Now, this is another example. So I also need somebody to point out what the problem is here before I run it.
Age is not defined.
Excellent. So the age here is not defined. Okay, so I'm trying to run this code. Let's run it and see what error gets returned. So we get name error, same as what we got beforehand. So there's an arrow pointing to where the error is, and there's a description of the name error. The name age is not defined. So how can we solve this problem? Simply by defining the variable age. So let's say age is 20, and this rightly executes correctly. So do you know how this type of error can typically happen? Is it's possible you have defined this age, but somehow in typing it, while typing really fast, you probably wrote something like this, age. So obviously it's going to drop an error. You knew what you were doing, you didn't forget to define age, but while typing, somehow you made that mistake from typing fast or something else. It could be from a variety of reasons, but it could definitely happen. So that is it. So I'll comment this out so you can at least get the error while you're running it on your own before you make the correction. Okay, so here I have some to do as well under this. The following code cells will return name error. Find and correct the errors. Okay, so the next we're discussing is type error. So type error, as I explained, gets returned when you try to carry out certain operations between differing data types. It could be between trying to add an integer to a list or trying to add a string to an integer, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I have some examples here. This returns an error for the obvious reason. So this is another line that returns an error. And this is the third that also returns an error. And this is the last, at least in these examples. So I'll scroll back up so we see the explanation of each. So the first here, type error. It's quite obvious to almost everybody at the moment that you cannot add integer to a string. And that is the description here. Type error, unsupported operand. I told you it has to be, you're trying to carry out certain operations. So the operand type here is plus. And we're trying to add an integer and a string. So it is not supported. If this had been multiplication, it's going to be just fine. Remember, you can multiply strings and you can see it there. If it is division, it won't be that successful. You're obviously going to get type error as well. If it is subtraction as well, it's going to be the same thing. So any operator you make use of here, aside multiplication, is going to return type error. So the next example here, we're trying to multiply two tuples. So in the class where we discussed data structures, I mentioned that tuple is a data type that supports very limited operations on it. In fact, the only operations it supports is looping through it, as well as accessing or index slicing, as well as indexing. Let me just say, tuple indexing and tuple index slicing. Those are the three main operations it supports. So, but in this situation, we're trying to multiply two tuples. It is not something that is allowed. And that's why you get can't multiply sequence by non-int of type tuple. So you can't multiply a sequence by a sequence. If this had been a list instead of a tuple, you'd also get the same error. So I'm trying to change this to a list. So what we have now is a list. You can see it. So if I run it, I still get the same error. Can't multiply sequence by non-int of type list. So what this means is you cannot multiply, this first one is a sequence, right? Or let me say the two are sequences. You cannot multiply a sequence by a sequence, but you can multiply a sequence by an int. So if I change this to just a single integer value, it's going to work just fine. You can see it. 3 has repeated itself 3 times in this list. So that is it. Let me revert to the, let me leave it as this. Okay, so here now we're trying to compare an integer to a tuple. It could also be a list, it could be a dict, it could be any data structure here in place of this tuple. So trying to compare it, we got an error. So this operator here is checking for greater than. Is not supported between instances of int and tuple. If it were list as well, it will return the same error. So, and the other example here, it says you cannot compare between an integer and string data type. Even though the string is of number type, you cannot compare it. So, and it rightly returns error. And of course, you know how to correct any of this or all of this. So we'll stop here and resume back at 5:30 using the alternate link. Thank you.